A woman spent 8 years in prison for a crime she didn't commit, and then the victim, the very woman whose testimony sent her away, walked into my courtroom and admitted she had made it all up. And in that moment, the foundations of my belief in the justice system were shaken to their very core. Because a courtroom is built on a single, sacred premise that we can, through evidence and testimony, uncover the truth. But what happens when the most compelling evidence is a perfect lie, a story so convincing and so emotionally powerful that it blinds everyone to the quiet, unbelievable truth? In this video, I will take you inside a case that began with a story of brutal violence and ended 8 years later with a confession that was even more shocking, a confession that destroyed careers, shattered lives, and forced me to confront the terrifying reality that sometimes the most dangerous person in a courtroom isn't the one on trial, but the one in the witness box. I'm Judge Chloe Dubois, and after 3 decades of wearing this robe, I have learned that a convincing story can be more powerful than any weapon. So subscribe and hit the bell because this is a story about the devastating power of a lie and the impossible search for justice when the truth comes far too late. The original case was from nearly a decade ago. The file number is seared into my memory, but the name that stands out is Amelia Hayes. She was the defendant, a quiet librarian in her early 30s with no criminal record, not even a parking ticket. She was accused of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon against her former friend, a charismatic and popular local artist named Jessica Riley. The story Jessica told was harrowing, and the entire courtroom listened with rapt, horrified attention. She claimed that Amelia, in a fit of jealous rage over a man they both knew, had attacked her in her own home with a heavy glass sculpture, a piece of art Jessica herself had created. Jessica stood on the witness stand, her arm in a sling, a faint pink scar visible on her forehead, just below her hairline, and she wept as she recounted the alleged attack. Her voice was filled with a genuine sounding terror that captivated the jury. She described the argument, the shouting, and then she described Amelia's eyes changing, becoming cold and unfamiliar. She said Amelia picked up the sculpture, a solid, twisted piece of blue glass that weighed nearly 10 pounds, and came at her with it. Jessica told the jury, I begged her to stop. I kept saying, Amelia, it's me. What are you doing? But it was like she couldn't hear me. She just had this dead look in her eyes. She was the perfect victim articulate, emotional and deeply sympathetic. I remember watching the jurors. They leaned forward in their seats, their faces a mixture of pity and outrage. They were hanging on her every word, living the assault with her. The prosecutor, a seasoned veteran named Bill Donovan, simply had to let her speak. His job was easy. Jessica was his star witness, and her testimony was his entire case. He would occasionally ask a gentle, guiding question like, and what happened next, Jessica? Or, how did that make you feel? And then he would step back and let her powerful performance fill the silence. He even presented text messages that, when taken out of context, seemed to support his narrative messages where Amelia expressed frustration with Jessica over a loan, which Donovan skillfully framed as the seeds of a growing, obsessive rage. He read them aloud with dramatic pauses. I can't believe you do this to me. You've put me in a terrible position, he read, letting the words hang in the air, allowing the jury to interpret them as a threat rather than a plea for repayment. Amelia Hayes, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. She sat at the defense table looking pale and bewildered, as if she had wandered into the wrong room and was too polite to leave her public defender. A young man who was earnest but clearly out of his depth argued that the story was a fabrication, that the two women had a falling out over money Amelia had loaned Jessica, and that Jessica had a history of dramatic and manipulative behavior. He tried to introduce evidence that Jessica had a pattern of creating elaborate stories to get out of financial obligations. But I sustained the prosecution's objection on the grounds of relevance. It was the correct legal ruling. At the time, character evidence is a tricky thing, and the focus had to be on the assault itself. But looking back, that ruling was another locked door in the hallway of justice that Amelia was trapped in. Amelia's defense was simply her word against Jessica's, and Jessica's word was backed by a visible injury and a river of tears. When Amelia took the stand, she was a terrible witness for her own defense. She was nervous. Her voice was barely a whisper, and she couldn't look the jury in the eye. She denied everything. But her denials were timid and uncertain compared to the powerful, emotional performance Jessica had delivered. She just kept repeating, I didn't do it. I would never do that. She was my friend. But she couldn't explain how Jessica got the injury. She suggested Jessica might have fallen or hurt herself accidentally, but it sounded weak, speculative, and desperate on cross examination. Bill Donovan was merciless. He didn't yell. He was calm and patronizing, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Ms. Hayes, he would say, are you asking this jury to believe that Ms. Riley, your supposed friend, fabricated this entire story, injured herself with a 10-pound glass sculpture, and is now committing perjury just to get back at you over a small loan? Is that your testimony? And faced with that logic, Amelia would just stammer and say, I don't know. I just know I didn't do it. I remember feeling a sense of frustration from the bench, a frustration with her inability to defend herself more forcefully, but I mistook my frustration with her for a sign of her guilt. The prosecution's narrative was simple and strong, a classic story of passion and betrayal. The defense's narrative was a confusing and unproven counterclaim of a bizarre and motiveless lie. I remember the closing arguments. Bill Donovan stood before the jury and spoke of the sanctity of friendship and the horror of being betrayed and attacked in one's own home. He pointed at Amelia and called her a wolf in sheep's clothing, a woman whose quiet exterior hid a violent and jealous heart. It was pure theater, but it was effective. The jury was out for less than a day. The verdict came back guilty. I looked at Amelia as the word was read, and her face crumpled in on itself, a silent scream of disbelief and despair. Her shoulders shook, but she made no sound. It was as if she had been hollowed out completely. I sentenced her to 10 years in state prison, the mandatory minimum for the charge. It was a heavy sentence, but my hands were tied by the jury's verdict and the sentencing guidelines as they led her away. She looked at me just once. Her eyes filled not with anger, but with a profound and bottomless sorrow, a sorrow that said, you are all making a terrible mistake. And that look, like so many others, became a ghost in the halls of my memory, a case I would think about from time to time, wondering if we had truly gotten it right. 8 years passed. Life moved on. I presided over thousands of other cases. Amelia Hayes became a closed file, a name from the past, a ghost I had long since filed away. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was in the middle of a tedious and complicated civil trial involving a zoning dispute. The air in the courtroom was stale with the drone of legal arguments and the rustling of papers. It was the kind of day that makes you question your life choices when suddenly the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom burst open and a woman stumbled in. She was disheveled. Her hair was a mess. Her clothes were wrinkled and her eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate energy. The bailiff moved immediately to intercept her. Ma'am, you can't be in here. He said, his voice firm, but she ignored him. Her gaze was locked on me. She walked unsteadily down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the now silent room. Everyone had stopped talking, the lawyers, the jury, the court reporter. We all just stared as this woman made her way toward the bench. It was only when she got closer that I recognized her. It was Jessica Riley, the victim from the Amelia Hayes case. But the vibrant, confident artist from 8 years ago was gone. This woman was a shadow of her former self. She looked haunted, broken by something I couldn't name. Her skin was pale, and her hands trembled uncontrollably. She stopped directly in front of my bench, her hands gripping the wooden rail as if to hold herself up. Her body was trembling, and she was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. The bailiff had his hand on her arm, now trying to pull her away, but she wouldn't budge. I have to say something. She said, her voice a raw, broken whisper. Please, I have to say something. I held up a hand to the bailiff. Let her speak. I said, my own voice calm. Despite the sudden knot of ice in my stomach, I had no idea what was about to happen, but I knew I needed to hear it. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Jessica took a deep, shuddering breath, and then she looked up at me, her eyes swimming with tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. I lied. She said the words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a bomb. I lied 8 years ago. I made it all up. Amelia Hayes, she never touched me. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The lawyers at their tables looked at each other in stunned disbelief. The jury in the box for the current trial craned their necks, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock. My own heart felt like it had stopped beating. I stared down at Jessica, trying to process what she had just said. It felt like a dream, a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. I found my voice, and it was colder and harder than I intended. What are you saying? I asked my words, cutting through the silence. Jessica finally broke her gaze, falling to the floor as a wave of sobs racked her body. I did it to myself. She choked out the words, tumbling out between gasps. The sculpture, I was angry and I had been drinking. I threw it against the wall and it bounced back and hit me in the head. I was so ashamed and so afraid to admit how stupid I had been. And Amelia and I had just had a terrible fight. I hated her in that moment. And so I called the police and I told them she did. If the story just came out of me, and once I started, I couldn't stop, it just got bigger and bigger, and everyone believed me. She looked up at me again, her face a mask of self-loathing. Everyone believed me, and I let an innocent woman go to prison for 8 years. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur of voices. The prosecutor from the current trial was on his feet objecting to the disruption, but I barely heard him. My mind was reeling, trying to connect the confident, weeping victim from 8 years ago with this broken woman confessing to a monstrous lie. I banged my gavel, the sound cracking through the noise like a gunshot order. I commanded, my voice shaking with an anger I couldn't control. Order in this court. I put the civil trial on immediate recess and cleared the courtroom, leaving only Jessica, the bailiffs, and the court reporter. I needed to understand. I needed to know everything. I took her into my chambers, and for the next hour, I listened as she poured out the whole sordid story, a story of petty jealousy, a drunken accident, and a lie that had spiraled into a catastrophe. She told me that the guilt had been eating her alive for years, that she had tried to confess once before, but had lost her nerve at the last minute. She said she had been seeing Amelia's face in her dreams every single night for 8 years, a silent, judging specter she couldn't escape. She told me she had finally hit rock bottom and knew she couldn't live with a lie anymore. No matter the consequences to herself leaving my chambers that day, I felt a cold fury, unlike any I had ever experienced. A fury at Jessica for her selfishness and her cruelty, but also a fury at myself and at the system I represented. We had been so easily fooled, so completely taken in by a good story and a convincing performance. We had failed. Amelia Hayes, at every single level, the police failed to investigate properly. The prosecutor failed to question his star witness's motives. And I had failed to see the doubt that had been nagging at me from the very beginning. I had allowed the power of an emotional narrative to override the fundamental principle of reasonable doubt. The legal process to free Amelia was set in motion immediately. It was a whirlwind of paperwork motions and emergency hearings, but it all felt like a hollow, bureaucratic exercise in the face of such a profound injustice. 2 weeks later, Amelia Hayes walked out of the state penitentiary, a free woman she had walked in as a quiet librarian in her early 30s, and she walked out as a hardened woman in her 40s with 8 years of her life stolen from her, a life she could never get back. I arranged to meet her. I felt I owed her that much. At least we met in a small private room at the courthouse, the same building where her life had been shattered all those years ago when she walked in. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger and it wasn't forgiveness. It was a kind of weary emptiness. Her face was pale and she was thinner than I remembered, but her eyes held a new kind of strength, a strength forged in the fires of an unimaginable injustice. I tried to apologize, but the words felt meaningless and pathetic. How do you say sorry for 8 years of stolen moments? I began, my voice cracking. 8 years of missed birthdays, holidays, and the simple, quiet joys of a normal life. How do you apologize for turning a mother into a visitor and a daughter into a memory behind glasses? She listened to me patiently, her hands resting calmly in her lap. And then she said something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. You know what the worst part was, Judge? She said, her voice soft but steady. It wasn't the prison itself. It wasn't the bad food or the constant noise or the loneliness it was that nobody believed me. It was the feeling of screaming the truth into a void and having no one hear you. It was the moment I realized that the truth doesn't matter if the story against you is better. I lost my faith in everything in that courtroom, not just in justice, but in people. She told me about the friends she lost, the family members who doubted her, the career she could never get back. She had been on a track to become a head librarian, a position she had worked for her entire adult life that was gone forever. She described the dehumanizing routine of prison life, the constant fear, and the struggle to hold on to her own identity when the entire world had labeled her a violent criminal. She spoke of the letters she wrote that were never answered, the appeals that were denied without comment, the slow, grinding process of being erased. Her words cut me to the core because she was right. We had chosen the better story over the simple, unbelievable truth. Jessica Riley was later charged with perjury and sentenced to prison herself, a small, bitter piece of irony in a story filled with tragedy, but it brought me no satisfaction. It didn't bring Amelia's years back. It didn't erase the damage that had been done. It was just another broken life in the wake of a single, devastating lie. This case taught me a terrifying lesson about the nature of our justice system. It is a system of stories, and whoever tells the better story often wins. We put witnesses on the stand, and we ask them to swear an oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But we have no way of looking into their hearts to see if they are telling the truth or simply performing it. We rely on cross examination on evidence on the collective wisdom of a jury. But as this case proves, all of that can be swept away by a single, compelling, and utterly false narrative. I became a much more skeptical judge. After that day, I learned to question the perfect victim just as much as the imperfect defendant. I started to pay more attention to what wasn't being said, to the gaps in a story, to the motivations that might be hiding in plain sight. I learned to listen to the silences in a testimony just as much as the words. I learned that my gut feeling, my human intuition, was not something to be dismissed, but a tool to be used, a warning sign that something might be wrong beneath the surface of a well-told story. It is a heavy burden to carry, to know that a person's life can be ruined, not by facts, but by a fiction that feels true. It forces you to ask a difficult question. If we can be so wrong, how many others have we failed? So I ask you, what is justice in a case like this? Amelia is free, but can she ever be whole? Jessica is in prison, but can that ever truly repair the damage she has caused? And what about the system itself? How can we trust it when it can be so easily manipulated by a convincing liar? How do we protect the innocent from a perfect lie? Let me know what you think in the comments, because these are the questions that keep me up at night. If this story has given you a new perspective on the fragility of truth, then please share it with someone you know. And if you want to hear more stories from my time on the bench, stories that reveal the real human drama behind the law, then hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm Judge Chloe, and I want you to remember that every story has two sides. And the truth is often hiding somewhere in the middle. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.